1746 AD, 5640 AM. Princeton College was founded by Protestants, oriented toward religious and moral philosophy. 1749 AD, 5643 AM. A storm at the West Azores uncovered a broken cask in the sand that contained a mass of ancient coins. Numismatists studied the coins and reported them to be Carthaginian from the 4th and 3rd century BC. 1. How the sun god reached America. 1751 AD, 5645 AM. A particularly damaging forgery of the Book of Jasher is published at Bristol, England. This copy came to the attention of scholars and they quite correctly labelled it a forgery. The real translation of the Book of Jasher ignored by academics because of the controversy. It is possible that the forgeries, another forgery was published in 1829, were designed to scare off the serious researcher, as the Book of Jasher is an amazing and ancient chronology of the Old World, a book mentioned twice in the Old Testament. 1752 AD, 5646 AM. On April 15th over Slavenge, Norway, was seen in the heavens a strange star of octagonal shape, and balls of fire fell from the sky, a streak across the sky seen from Ångermanland. This was exactly 3600 years, 600 times 6, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Indus Valley cities in 1849 BC. In this year, Benjamin Franklin proved that lightning is electricity and theorized that it could somehow be harnessed. The famous Liberty Bell was cast in England and delivered to Isaac Norris, who ordered it in Pennsylvania, bearing the inscription from the book of Leviticus 25:10, quote, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," unquote. This same year the bell cracked, and the colonial American company Parsons Stowe recast the bell with less copper and more iron, to be expected from a nation to become an iron empire. In this year, Great Britain finally adopted the Gregorian calendar implemented by Pope Gregory XIII and decreed that the calendrical system would also be adopted by the 13 colonies of America. September the 2nd thus became September 14th, and all dates prior to the alteration were designated OS for Old Style. 1. Book of the Damned. 1753 AD, 5647 AM. The Liberty Bell is placed in the Philadelphia State House and was used by the Continental Congress. 1754 AD, 5648 AM. George Washington leads the colonial militia in the French and Indian War. The 13 colonies allied to the 5 nations of the Iroquois Indians against the French, a war fought between French Canada and the British colonies. The French capture a British fort and Washington leads 160 militiamen and builds Fort Necessity. The French with their own Indian allies besieged the fort, and with no food or supplies, torrential rains having dampened their gunpowder, Washington surrendered on July 4th, as 2,000 men besieged his small unit. George was a devout colonial loyal to the English and the son of the Christian mystic Mary Ball. She raised George to believe that fear and cowardice were sins and that courage was faith that God could see him through all trials. Missionaries in South America discovered Phoenician inscriptions on toppled pillars in the Amazon jungle. Jean de Elembert published his article entitled Dimension, where he postulated that time was the 4th dimension. 1. A Patriot's History of the United States. 2. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 3. Hyperspace. 1755 AD, 5649 AM. George Washington of the colonial militia advised British General Braddock on the unusual guerrilla tactics employed in North America, explaining that European-type warfare was not conducted in America. The Indians had taught the English colonials about this style of fighting, a method unknown to the Redcoats. General Braddock ignored George Washington and marched 1,000 Redcoats and 300 colonials toward Fort Duquesne. The French were warned of the British advance, obtained help from their Indian allies, and even the aid of an old Indian sharpshooter, with an established reputation for having never missed a target. The The sharpshooter was employed by the French to kill George Washington, who was feared more so over that of General Braddock. On July 9th, only miles away from the fort, 300 concealed French and Indian soldiers fired upon and killed or wounded 800 of General Braddock's men. While the redcoats fled in panic, George Washington stood his ground, commanding the 300 colonials who trusted him from past experience, fighting off the ambush. The old Indian shot at Washington and was amazed that he missed, shot again and again and a fourth time, all missing the towering enemy commander. The Indian was spooked because he knew he did not miss those shots. General Braddock died in the ambush, and years later after the war, the old Indian visited the camp of George Washington at the Virginia colony, explaining that it was he that had shot at him those 4 times for the French. George pulled out the old coat he had worn in that battle and showed the Indian the 4 bullet holes, but told him that not a bullet hit his body. The Indian concluded that George was charmed, fated to never die in battle. This visit was in 1762, 13 years before the Revolutionary War. On June 7th, a quake in Persia killed 40,000 people. This was followed in November, on All Saints' Day, by a transcontinental earthquake that shook the islands and seas from the Baltic to the West Indies, and Canada to Egypt, Algiers, Morocco, throughout northern Africa, up to Germany, Holland, Spain and France. About 10,000 people in Morocco were swallowed by the earth, and the world-famous port of Lisbon, Portugal, was worst afflicted. An expansive granite quay fractured off and plunged into the sea, drowning 60,000 people who had fled to it thinking it was the safest place. Whole ships in the harbour were pulled underwater as the city trembled and burned. Not a trace of those unfortunate people or ships were ever found. No clothes, no bodies, no driftwood. The seafloor in that region dropping 600 feet. By 2 p.m. as far as England that day, it was noted that the ocean was unusually restless with high waves. Both England and Scotland were shaken by the mighty quake, causing the people to fast and pray at specially held services. The churches throughout were full of people, being All Saints' Day, and these buildings killed many. About 85% of Lisbon was destroyed, and lost among the ruins were a collection of ancient artefacts of Roman vintage that had been excavated in Peru. At the same time of the earthquake, the warm springs of Teplitz, Bohemia, disappeared, but later sprouted forth again. A volcano in Iceland erupted, followed by an uprising, and then subsidence of the water of Loch Lomond in Scotland. Just 2 weeks prior to the earthquakes, many meteorites were seen brightly directly over Lisbon, Portugal. 1. Uncommon sense. 2. The antediluvian world. 3. Great disasters. 4. The complete story of the San Francisco horror. 5. The story of philosophy. 6. The lost treasure of King Juba. 8. Book of the Damned.